Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Claire Wainwright. I'm a paediatric respiratory physician from the Royal Children's in Brisbane. It's very, very exciting for me and a huge honour to welcome you all this morning to the opening session of the Research Translation Faculty Symposium. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. And I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to the other Indigenous Australians present. As you would all know, last Friday, Minister Plibersek announced $652 million for 1,141 research grants for groundbreaking medical research across Australia. NHMRC are going to be very busy administering those grants. It's going to be a huge undertaking to do that. We also know that those grants, while they're going to lead to new knowledge, there may be gaps in the translation of that knowledge. We're all aware of that. We know that the translation of research findings into equitable improvements in health outcomes can take up to 10 to 20 years from the original findings to the practical application of those findings at the bedside. We also know that even when we have the knowledge and the use of those important research findings at the bedside, that the standards of care can still be missing. And we know that that happens right across healthcare facilities. We need a new approach. We need a new way to ensure that we can translate those research findings into practical approaches for improving healthcare outcomes. And that's why we're all here today. And I think for all clinicians particularly, it's something we see every single day in our clinical practice. So I think that's part of the reason there's been such an amazing response in the research and healthcare community to this call for this new faculty. Now, the Research Translational Faculty, I think, is a very exciting innovation. It's a very exciting initiative, and it's going to be a key advisory forum for NHMRC to meet these challenges. Napoleon once said, "Ability is of little account without opportunity." And this new faculty, I think, is going to provide some of those new opportunities for us. I'm personally very excited because I currently chair the Healthcare Committee for NHMRC, and we're going to have a very close relationship with ensuring the outcomes of the faculty. Now, over the course of today, we're going to hear from a number of people about the faculty and about the translation of research findings. In this session this morning, we're going to hear from keynote speaker Professor Larry Green about knowledge translation in context, and also from Professor Warwick Anderson, who's going to talk about he's going to open the faculty and also talk to us about how the faculty is going to work. And now it's my enormous pleasure to introduce Professor Warwick Anderson. He really needs very little introduction to this audience. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the NHMRC and really is going to talk to us and open the faculty today. So welcome, Warwick.
Thanks, Claire. Well, thank you, Claire, and welcome to you all. I'm very grateful and impressed by your willingness to come and help us with this task. You do understand there's work ahead, so that's excellent. I also just wanted to mention that the Minister, the Honourable Tanya Plibersek, sends her best. When I was with her on Friday announcing the grants, she wanted it to be known that she was feeling very positive about this initiative and was looking forward to the outcomes. I could acknowledge you all because you're all distinguished members of the health and medical research community, and of course you only get to be part of the faculty by surviving NHMRC's peer review processes. But there are a few people I should particularly acknowledge. Of course, Claire, as she said, is the chair of the Health Committee of the NHMRC. And we have other people on NHMRC's principal committees here today. Catherine North, who you'll hear from later, is the chair of Research Committee. Sally Green, who's a member of Healthcare Committee, and Helena Teed as well, who you'll hear from. Jane Gunn from Research Committee, Samar Aoun from the Ethics Committee and the Prevention and Community Health Principal Committee, Mandy Thrift from Research Committee, and Andy Sinclair from the Human Genetics Advisory Committee, and I think Ian Caterson from Prevention Committee is also here. I'd like to also welcome Larry Green. Thank you for agreeing to do this, Larry. I know that, as usual, when somebody comes to Australia, we work you hard, so that's excellent. We try not to damage your wife or husband for people who come to Australia, but we seem to fail that, actually. This research translation faculty is the biggest strategic initiative of the NHMRC for this coming triennium. And so again, thank you for agreeing to be part of it. We're serious about trying to tap your skills and your brains to make our health system better and improve the health of individual Australians. And so, as I will explain in more detail later this morning, we're going to focus your effort on two really quite specific but very powerful things. Now, research translation, I suppose, is all things to all people. There are 1,000 different definitions. But you know that this idea's time has come when that Bible of basic discovery research, Nature, features research translation in one of its issues, as it did in 2008. Discovery, of course, remains absolutely the centre and core of what we do and what you do, but the expectation on us all has grown over the last 4 or 5 years to make sure that the community benefits from those discoveries as best can be done. Late last year, I invited the heads of all the other leading health and medical research funding organisations to a meeting in Canberra, when we invited up-and-coming researchers from Australia as the audience. And I invited all of those, Francis Collins from NIH, head of the UK MRC, the EU framework, China Academy of Science, and Canada, and so on, to talk about their vision of what they saw the main challenges were between now and 2020. And to a person, they identified that not only funding great research, but making sure the people of our countries benefited from that research was the main challenge that they needed to address. This has been a challenge for the NHMRC since we were first established in 1936. The then Minister for Health, Billy Hughes, when he was announcing the formation of the NHMRC, said that research must be actively pursued and developed, and as fast as new knowledge is acquired, it must be applied. You could use those words today to say what we're here for. So, yes, do the research, but also do what we can to make sure it's applied to the benefit of the people of our community. Now, I hope you are aware that the NHMRC has been changing over the last decade to try and meet this challenge generally. I just wanted to mention a couple of our funding schemes for those who aren't aware of them. I guess the main one of recent times is our Partnerships for Better Health initiatives. These are both project grants and centres, partnerships with state governments, NGOs or private sector organisations to address the research needs of those organisations. We've rolled out now, I think, 3 years of these project grants, and last time I looked, which is about 3 months ago, there were about 220 partner organisations from relatively small NGOs or community-based organisations through all the states, and in a couple of instances quite large private organisations, including, since we're here in Melbourne, the Australian Football League as a partner for a couple of grants. We also are introducing a new Partnerships for Better Health Centres initiative. 2 are underway. The first is in dementia or in cognitive decline, and that's a partnership with some state governments and some private providers of aged care, co-funding centres. And the second one is with the Australian National Preventive Health Agency and some state governments on a systems approach to prevention of ill health. Better established, the Centres for Research Excellence, they're clinical or public health or health services research, and Peter Ebling, who's sitting in the front row and who you'll hear from later today, of course, was a pioneer with his colleagues of setting up a meeting to bring together the Centres of Research Excellence in a conference over recent years. The Practitioner Fellowship, I'm sure you know about too. These are people who are employed in the health system to deliver care and where we provide a half-time fellowship. We've been expanding our support of clinical trials. Over $100 million of project grants this year are clinical trials. That's about 1 in 6 dollars of project grants will be spent on clinical trials this year, from very small early clinical trials to later stage. And we are thinking through our policy with support of clinical trials and with research committee and then with the general community, be seeing whether there are other ways that we can further support investigator-initiated clinical trials. One of our other translational grants are the industry development grants. We will be focusing part of the research translation faculty on commercialisation translation in 2003. But we're about to release a survey of the outcomes of the development grant scheme, which show absolutely stunning results. These proof of principle grants have stimulated extraordinary commercial growth in Australia. And some of you, I hope, have looked at our 10 of the best publication, where we look at your final reports each year and through peer review processes identify against criteria the best of those final reports, and I can see Marshall over here on my left. But if you read that, those 10 of the best reports, you'll see that so much of that research is around translation. We've also been active internationally in a way that perhaps we weren't in the past at the NHMRC. We fund quite a lot of research throughout Asia as part of normal project grants or centres. We are members of the International Cancer Genome Consortium, and tomorrow in Nature, the first big paper out of the Queensland group looking at pancreatic and ovarian cancer will be published as a major publication in Nature. And we recently announced our funding of implementation research as part of the Global Alliance for Chronic Disease, together with NIH, Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and the NHMRC. We're funding a bunch of coordinated research on blood pressure control in the community in low and middle income countries. But to return to the faculty, I guess it's here in Australia that we want to gather your support to help meet this challenge that the health system faces to provide effective care, cost-effective care effective for patients and therefore based on research evidence. Now, some of you, I think, attended a workshop we held about 1.5 years ago in Canberra. It was the first step in our thinking about developing this research translation faculty. There were over 100 senior researchers at that meeting. We have expanded our views. I think we were initially thinking that we would focus especially on the clinical translation area, but many people said to us at that meeting, and since that of course everything's connected in the health system, so we have to think across the 4 pillars of research in this. It's got to be clinical. We have to take a population approach as well, so we need our public health research colleagues. It's about how the system works, so we need the health services researchers, and we need everybody across the whole biomedical spectrum. So there are no sides to the members of the faculty. We want you all. 4 or 5 months ago now, I think, or maybe a little less than that, we sent out 7,000 invitations, and it was to everybody who was a chief investigator on any of our grants. I'll talk in the second talk today on why restricting it to NHMRC researchers. But of those 7,000, over 2,000 in the first few days, and now getting towards 3,000 of the people invited to join the faculty have joined up. And I think that's a tremendous indication of the commitment that the Australian health and medical research community has to making sure that Australia benefits from the work that you do. The 2 main tasks that we'll start off asking you to do will be the following. I'll give much more detail on those in the second part of this morning, but they're going to be 2 main tasks. The first is to work on identifying the most important, the most significant gaps between what we know and what we do in the health system. So the biggest evidence practice gaps. Now, they will be in some very specific areas. Those specific areas will be defined by the NHMRC strategic plan, which is required to identify, our strategic plan is required to identify the major health issues we will work on over the 3-year period of our coming triennium. The triennium starts on the 1st of January next year, and the strategic plan has to be tabled in Parliament by the end of this year and be tabled by Minister Plibersek. So identify the main gap, and then identify what the NHMRC can do to fill that gap. Now, I'll go through the details of what those actions can be. Research can be one of them, but in many cases that's not what will be required. What will be required is us to speak up publicly, either to government or to the general community, or perhaps to professional bodies about what needs to be done. But there will be the opportunity to identify key targeted research need to make sure that we know how to best bridge that gap between evidence and practice and policy. Now, they're the first tasks, but over the coming year we will expand what the faculty does and how we can support you and how you can support the Australian health system. Just a couple of final words, Chair. Obviously, clinical trials are an important part of working out what works and what doesn't in the health system. And there's a couple of things I'd just like to draw your attention to today. The first is that we've done what we can to make sure that getting approval to conduct multi-centre clinical trials can work more easily than it has in the past. We have now credentialed around 40 ethics committees across the country. We've looked at them in great detail and have certified that they're up to the task of high quality ethics approval. So from our point of view, from the NHMRC's point of view, you can go to any one of these, and if you have ethics approval, you have ethics approval. Now, of course, research also occurs in hospitals and other places, and so you still have to get governance approval from those institutions. But again, on our website, under the portal on the home page, we think there are all the checklists, all the templates, all the material that you need to make sure that the system can work better than it has in the past. Why am I mentioning this? Because given that Australia is a commonwealth, and given that health, especially the hospital system, is the responsibilities of the state, we would hope that those of you who are involved in clinical trials can do a bit of push here, that you can push the states to make sure that they don't stand in the way of this simplified, streamlined harmonisation of ethics approval. The second thing is that we've just opened a website, clinicaltrials.gov.au, I think, which will be built up over the years to provide easier access by the community to what's happening in clinical trials in Australia. And we also have on our website a separate place, a site for the clinical networks there are in Australia, clinical trials networks, so that you can work better together. And my staff have already had a couple of workshops with some of those networks to make things better coordinated. I said earlier that one of the hopes we have of you as the faculty is that after you've identified the major and most significant evidence practice gaps and thought about what action should occur, the possibility of a targeted research call is there, and Research Committee has tucked aside a little money each year for this. It's likely that the research that's needed will often be what has become called comparative effectiveness research. Now, the NHMRC currently funds comparative effective research through the normal peer review process. I think about $30 million is being spent this year on such research. And Rochelle Bookbinder, who with her colleagues published some NHMRC-funded research in this area a few years ago, will speak to you later today. Her research actually was commented on by the then Prime Minister as a way that research can help the government make sure it provides cost-effective care. So I think comparative effectiveness research is likely to be a focus that you will have. So, as I said earlier, we have tremendous support from the community in Australia. All the polls show that the community really supports health and medical research and are likely to jack up a little if there are threats that might be cut. And of course, new discovery has to be at the heart of this. But those who support our research, the taxpayers, the community of Australia, I think do look to us to make sure that we do have a more effective health system, a system that can deliver them the best care. And so by agreeing to help us with the research translation faculty and being in early to help us mould our ideas and develop this concept, you're putting your hand up to meet their expectations. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Warwick. And now it's a huge pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Professor Larry Green. He's from the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, School of Medicine at the University of California, and he's going to talk to us today about the translation of knowledge in translation and the context. So thanks very much, Professor Green.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Warwick Anderson and Carol Wainwright. I'm immensely pleased to have this opportunity. It's become a passion of mine to further this particular cause, and I'm a great admirer of the initiative that you, Professor Anderson, have stimulated in this country. And we look to your country for innovation in other countries. I'm going to speak a little about the experience in Canada, a little more about the experience in the USA. And I will focus particularly on the issues that arise as we get beyond the bench to bedside part of translation and onward to the issues of taking knowledge and evidence to scale, taking it to broader communities. The purpose is then that Professor Helena Teed helped me get a fix on for this segment of your program are first to offer a brief overview of key concepts in the area of knowledge translation and insights around practice-based evidence. Secondly, recent trends in Canada and the US in this field, and I'll actually start there. And then finally, opportunity for interactive discussion. And I'll try my best to leave at least 15 minutes for the latter. You had the privilege of a Canadian, Jonathan Lomas, here for 6 months recently and more before that. Jonathan, in my view, should be credited with having stimulated the development of the whole translational research issues as it developed in Canada in particular and spilled over a great deal in the US. We were together on a program in Amsterdam of the European Public Health Association when he presented this perspective on the gap between researchers and policymakers, whether the policymakers are national, state, or local. Where am I? The people in the balloon ask. You're 30 meters above the ground in a balloon. You must be a researcher. Yes, how did you know? Because what you told me is absolutely correct, but completely useless. You must be a policymaker. Yes, how did you know? Because you don't know where you are, you don't know where you're going, and now you're blaming me. So we have this dichotomy of worldviews. And what Jonathan developed over many years was the notion that we're not going to get this job done with a pipeline notion of transferring knowledge from science to practice, that we've got to build a two-way exchange. And as he tried to make that happen in Canada, he found that that gap that was described in the previous slide was too wide for them to bridge by themselves. So he concocted the concept of a knowledge broker, someone who would bring them to the table together, out of their separate towers, and to a common table in which someone can help them understand each other's language. So the knowledge broker concept became central to the foundation that Lomas headed in Canada, the Foundation for Health Services Research. And then it became embedded in the CIHR, the Canadian Institute for Health Research, and it in turn created centers of excellence across the country to promote the notions of knowledge transfer. In the US, the National Institutes of Health formulated what came to be called the Roadmap Initiative. This was an initiative, like Professor Anderson, of a new director in the early part of the century, Elias Zerhouni. Zerhouni came from Hopkins, and he put a stamp on this, which he called the Roadmap Initiative, translating discoveries into health. And it consisted of getting from basic research, preclinical studies, animals research on the left, through Translation 1, T1, with case series, phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials, the translation to humans. And at the bedside, human clinical research, controlled observational studies, and phase 3 clinical trials. He also talked about T2, Translation 2, which would be getting from the bedside to practice, clinical practice, the delivery of recommended care to the right patient at the right time, identification of new clinical questions, and gaps in care. He said the roadmap identifies the most compelling opportunities in 3 arenas, and these have become somewhat institutionalized in the grant making of NIH: new pathways to discovery, research teams of the future, and re-engineering the clinical research enterprise. And indeed, comparative effectiveness research has been one of the mainstays of this initiative. T2, however, became, as one pundit put it, the roadmap less traveled. And this was a play on the words from Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled. And it became a concern that so much resource was going into T1, particularly with the encouragement, not to say the forceful and lucrative lobbying by the pharmaceutical industry. T1 was getting all of the attention, and T2 very little. And I use this issue as a pretext for a commentary in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, which has made me unpopular in some circles. Another article came out, playing off of the Zerhouni roadmap, in which Jack Westphal and his colleagues in the Journal of the American Medical Association described the blue highways on the NIH roadmap. I think your maps are like ours, with the red lines being the major highways and the blue lines being lesser highways. The blue highways on the NIH roadmap he described more thoroughly as the practice-based research, T2, phase 3 and phase 4 clinical trials, observational studies, survey research, all of which feed directly into guideline development, meta-analysis, and systematic reviews. And Sally Green will be talking some about those things this afternoon. On the right, though, T3 is where the dissemination research and the implementation research are really at the heart of the translation process. And they involve program evaluation, continuous quality improvement, policy analysis, technical assistance in evidence-based practice adaptation, and systems research. All of those things were needed, it was found increasingly, to make sense of how these things really get planted and implemented in and at the local level institutions. The most frequently quoted phrase in both Canada and the US is that it takes 17 years to turn 14% of original research to the benefit of patient care. This came from a study in a somewhat fugitive source, a proceedings of a conference in Germany, published in English but in Germany, and it's been very difficult for most people to get their hands on it. But I tried to reconstruct how Bayless and his colleagues came to these numbers, 17 years and 14%. And the 14% represents 14% of original research that ultimately gets applied. The biggest, an initial loss is 18% of the research that doesn't get submitted for publication, often because the authors or the researchers got negative results and they're concerned that editors are biased against publishing negative results. And to the extent that they are, they may not find very much acceptance. Another 46% of the studies are lost between submission and acceptance, essentially not accepted. If they're accepted, they are very likely to be published because they've gone through peer review and the editor is committed to them. But then there is this loss, although probably less today than it was in the year 2000 when this was published, the loss between publication and being indexed in retrieval systems, bibliographic databases, and then accessible to systematic reviews and guidelines and textbooks that ultimately reach the practitioners. So a loss there of some 50%, particularly attributed to inconsistent indexing. Now the time between these points of loss in the pipeline are about half a year between submission and acceptance, another half a year between acceptance and publication, about a third of a year between publication and being indexed in bibliographic databases, 6 to 13 years, a great lag here between the databasing and indexing and the ultimate review for guidelines and textbooks. And then 9.3 years before we see an average of all of that being implemented. Now, note that the implementation really does not represent a loss in volume, it represents a loss in time. So the tendency to blame the practitioners needs to be focused on what are their issues. Part of the problem, in my view, is that we have tended to conceptualize all of this as a pipeline, and I refer to this as the pipeline fallacy of producing and vetting research to get evidence-based practice. This 17-year odyssey that Bayless described then involves starting with priorities for research funding. Peer review of grants begins to squeeze that. Public peer review and publication priorities tend to squeeze it a little further before it's published. Research syntheses, things that don't qualify for being included in the systematic reviews, squeezes it further. The guidelines for evidence-based practice that can be educed from all of that squeezes it yet further. And so then we get this something like a trickle into practice, but even that is without sufficient concern or attention or acknowledgement of the issues that the practitioner is up against with respect to funding, patient needs, patient demands, local practice circumstances, professional discretion, credibility and fit of the evidence in general. Now this professional discretion issue is one that I want to say another word about, and that is that to the degree that we present the evidence that we have put through this vetting process, this pipeline, to the extent that we represent it as the necessary behavior of a practitioner, we are robbing that professional of what makes him or her a professional. What distinguishes a professional from a technician is that the technician would apply the guidelines assiduously and without particular application of what they've learned in medical school or nursing school or any other professional school. A professional needs to bring to bear some knowledge of the patient, an understanding of the patient's circumstances, an understanding of the patient's history, all of which complicate the certainty of the evidence that constitute the guidelines, the relevance of the evidence in many cases. And so I do want to suggest that we be cautious about the degree to which we are not giving sufficient discretion to the practitioner in applying evidence-based guidelines. The evidence-based medicine movement, from Archie Cochran to David Sackett to R. Brian Haynes, who started the Journal of Evidence-Based Medicine, has had a powerful influence on the way we think about evidence. It's affected the way our publication priorities and peer review, our research synthesis, our guidelines for evidence-based practice, and even the behavior of the practitioners themselves as they are schooled and imbued with the notions of evidence-based medicine. It's also influenced academic appointments, promotion, and tenure criteria. And it's influenced peer review of grants, publication priorities, and peer review. And all of that leads us then to, when we don't see the application of the knowledge that we have we vetted through this pipeline, when we don't see it applied, we tend to blame the practitioner, or we blame our failures of dissemination. Now, my latest villain in all of this is impact factor scoring of journals. My concern there is not that it is not an objective measure, although it has been tainted in various perverse behaviors of some of the editors of journals and editorial boards, but it has become a very influential determinant of the academic appointments, promotion, and tenure. And what concerns me about it is that it is a measure of the academic impact, not the practical impact, the policy impact, the program impact of any given article or journal. Well, when we put all the research together, the research indicates that we really should do something with all this research. And bridging the evidence gap has become a popular metaphor for describing the problem. Another agency in the US, besides the NIH, two other agencies I should say, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, headed by Carolyn Clancy, and the Centers for Disease Control, headed by Tom Frieden, are very active partners in the growing enterprise of research translation. The way that Carolyn Clancy has conceptualized it uses a term that I gather you're using here too, namely TRIP, Translating Research into Practice. And her notion is represented graphically as filling the gap rather than bridging the gap, filling it with diffusion of an education, adoption, implementation, innovation. All good things, all things we'd like to see happening and I think to be encouraged. But it is somewhat reminiscent of the fallacy of the empty vessel that plagued our practice of public health education for a long time. We conceive of the end users of our knowledge, our evidence, as being an empty vessel, and if we pour enough information into the empty vessel, we'll get the behavior and behavior change we seek. Well, let me drive towards some conclusions by suggesting 5 ways of making research more relevant for practice. Ways that seem to have emerged out of the Canadian and American experience, the UK experience, and I dare say much of what I see coming out of Australia and New Zealand. First of all, we need to get back to our roots as scientists and researchers of making our research more theory-based, making clear what the theory is that underlies what we have posited as a plausible intervention that we're testing with an expected outcome. Setting research and evaluation priorities strategically in relation to the needs that people have for evidence, not merely the needs that we have for building our respective science or discipline. Third, making research findings actionable, usable, relevant. Relevant to whom? Relevant to the practitioners and their patients or communities. Disseminating and translating or adapting research to local circumstances, cultures, and personnel. There's a whole enterprise that this particular one warrants, deserves, because we do live in multicultural societies, and we need to be sensitive to the differing perspectives that people bring to the problem of applying our science. And finally, making evidence more practice-based. I'll come back to that one as a conclusion. So we have all of these concerns and needs and conditions under which the practitioners are working that we need to pay more attention to. NIH put out a request for applications in 2006 that looked something like this. They called for applications to identify, develop, and refine effective and efficient methods, structures, and strategies that test models to disseminate and implement research-tested, my emphasis, health behavior change interventions and evidence-based prevention, early detection, diagnostic treatment, etc. There were two problems with these framings of the issue, in my view. One, are the research-tested interventions that they want to see tested in their application adequate to the settings in which they would be tested? Are they appropriate to other settings and populations than those in which they were developed or tested for their efficacy in the first place? To illustrate the first problem, there was a study in Canada following on a request from the Canadian Cancer Society, a request for proposals for a review of the evidence to answer 4 questions. 1, are group counseling programs for smoking cessation effective? 2, if so, what's the optimal content of the sessions? 3, what's the optimal number and frequency of sessions that should be offered? And 4, what are the characteristics of the most effective facilitators? Now, these are very simple, practical questions. They are typical of the kinds of questions that an implementing agency needs to have answers to if they're going to make a major commitment to, in this case, group counseling programs for smoking cessation. The contract was won by a group at Waterloo University, Steve Mansk and his colleagues at the University of Waterloo, and they did a comprehensive literature review of some 2,000 studies that had been conducted over 40 years, published and some unpublished. They found the usual deficiencies in purpose, design, and reporting of many of the studies. They found that the research could answer only the first of the 4 questions, that group programs for smoking cessation are effective. They couldn't answer the other questions that were necessary for the Cancer Society to make a major financial commitment to promoting and disseminating these group counseling programs. And I don't want to paint all research with this brush, but I dare say that this is probably one of the essential deficiencies of the research that we're getting, and that is that it doesn't answer the questions that the practitioners and the practice implementing agencies are asking. Even Archie Cochrane and his colleagues, in constructing a second edition of his book, came to a view that they referred to as the post-Cochrane challenge. They identified 3 spheres. 1, good evidence, A. B, potential for good evidence. C, information of potential importance to patients in making healthcare choices. Well, the area where there is currently good evidence-based information of importance to patients in making choices, they concluded at the turn of the century, rather small. The area of information of importance to patient choice that is potentially of evidence-based type, somewhat larger, but still small. Information of importance to patient choices that is not even potentially of evidence-based type because of ethical or practical random assignment problems in particular, very large indeed. And so the post-Cochrane challenge, they concluded, was to look for alternative ways to carry out evaluation of programs, the study of programs in real time with real practitioners, practice-based evidence, I would call it. Just a word or two about setting research priorities. There's a big difference, as I suggested, between the way that NIH has approached this problem, this issue in the US, and the way that CDC has approached it, because they have different missions, different capacities, different relationships with the field. NIH, looking at these two dimensions, from the molecular level to the population level, and this continuum from basic to applied to clinical trials to demonstration and education research. Robert Levy, who was then in the early 70s, the director of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute of NIH, was really being belabored by Congress, most of whom were susceptible to heart disease at their age, to show what was being applied of all this research in which Congress had invested. And Robert Levy came up with what has come to be known as the Levy arrow, which is broad at the basic research end. We've got to do a lot of basic research, he argued, before we can take some of it to the applied research level, and so forth down the line, to the point that we have a relatively small amount of knowledge that we can take to demonstration and education research. So that, the NIH arrow, has been emblazoned in a lot of NIH documents to this date. CDC was up against the fact that they were never going to win the horse race in Congress with NIH in getting more funds for the kind of research they could do. And so the argument became, in a committee that I chaired for them, that we needed an antidote to the Levy arrow, which was the CDC wedge, narrow at the basic end and broad at the demonstration and education research end. All of these variations acknowledge the same process, from knowledge acquisition to knowledge translation. But CDC had the advantage in certain areas. One is surveillance across the country, and surveillance at least down to the state level that allowed comparison between jurisdictions of great interest to members of Congress. Community and statewide effectiveness trials of their block grants to the states, program evaluation which they required of every grantee, and all of that led to the kind of data that was more practice-based and more immediately usable by the people in the field. A variation on these that really is at the intersect of NIH and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality and CDC are practice-based research networks and continuous quality improvement. And these become the nexus or the intersection of community, population-based research and clinical research. T1, T2, and so forth, all as before. just a word about what I then see as the drift that we have fallen into and need to correct. The internal validity drift, that is our obsession with internal validity at the expense of external validity. The evidence-based medicine movement, when taken to scale in general practice and health promotion at the community or population level, struggles with the fact that they've got proof that something can work, the efficacy evidence from rigorous, high internal validity trials, but always questionable as it's taken to different settings in different populations and different cultures, different contexts. The peer review preferences for experimental control and certainty of causation, the publishing preferences for RCTs and positive results, the limitations of print space driving out richer description of interventions, protocols, procedural lessons, subgroup variations, all of which are of great interest to the practitioners, but they get squeezed out of much of our literature. Indeed, subgroup analysis fell into disrepute when some big trials, like Mr. Fit, the multiple risk factor intervention trials in the early 70s, came up with rather lackluster results. And there was a scramble to do subgroup analyses to understand who it worked for and who it didn't. The biostatisticians hit the ceiling and said, you can't do that. The subgroups weren't randomized. And with that broad-scale declaration, a lot of people have shied away from, including editors, publishing subgroup analyses. Let me conclude then with a more natural type of practice-based evidence that has greater influence on multi-level program planning, practice, and policy, and that is the evaluation of real programs. I'll illustrate it very briefly. The 50 states in the US were chugging along in the early to mid-1980s at about 1.5% per year reduction in tobacco consumption, including California and Massachusetts. In 1990 to 92, the other 48 states were still going at that rate, but then California passed a referendum, a popular vote, to put a higher tax on cigarettes and to devote a large proportion of that tax, or a proportion, I should say, to a comprehensive tobacco control program statewide. They then doubled the rate of the other 48 states. Massachusetts had not yet done so, and they were still going at about 1.5% per year. In 1992 to 96, following the California had now hit its stride and was tripling the rate of the other 48 states. Massachusetts passed an even higher tax, devoted a larger proportion of it to a comprehensive statewide program, and now they were quadrupling the rate of the other 48 states. Now, clearly, California and Massachusetts were not randomized. The other states said, we're not California and we're not Massachusetts. But, by the way, what the hell did they do to get those results? They paid more attention to these two state results than they paid to a history of over, as I said earlier from the Waterloo study, some 2,000 studies that had been done with randomized controlled trials. And I'm not here to dismiss or despair randomized controlled trials. I don't want to take a drug that hasn't been submitted rigorously to that kind of testing. But when it comes to the broader programmatic initiatives that our society demands in the face of tobacco control, obesity control today, the epidemic that is plaguing our countries, the evidence simply doesn't tell us clearly what needs to be done in every setting, and we need to pay attention to the experience of those who are innovating on the fly and evaluate those programs. And that's my hope for the future of your initiative. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Green, for a fantastic talk. And now I'm going to introduce Professor Warwick Anderson, who's going to talk really about how the faculty is going to work and give us some of the nuts and bolts of how this really exciting initiative is going to set off. So thanks very much, Warwick.
Thank you, Claire, and I feel it's a little bit from the visionary Larry to the nuts and bolts. But what I plan to do is take you through the next steps that we have in mind for the faculty, and as I'm doing that, I'm aware of what is on your mind that came out of the questions that you asked, Larry, what the incredible ramifications of this whole conceptual concept is about. So I'm thinking this is only a little part, but I think a very powerful part that will drive, I hope, some real changes in our system. So thanks again for joining. Shortly, but not just yet, there'll be a place on our NHMRC website that will allow you to log in and officially join and give us some further details from you all. As usual with all these web-based processes, it'll need a password, and of course, if you're like me, you'll lose that a lot, but we'll have ways of helping you remember. You'll also have a personalised dashboard, which is probably little point in describing what that will involve right now. You can explore it when you get there, but it'll identify those areas that you've identified you're interested in working on. It'll have some information type material there under recent topics, and a pile of tools and resources and so on. Now that'll be a bit skint to start off with, but we'll be building it progressively as we develop the faculty. A key part of the website will be support of discussions between you all as members of the faculty, so that you can work together on the tasks that we're going to set out for you. Now this, as I say, is not quite live, but my staff over here, and I'm outing them, Alan Singh, Marion Berry, assure me, and it's in writing here, they expect it to be live by the end of the day and tomorrow at the latest. Okay, guys, is that all right? Thank you. What will be up on the website, and I'll describe this later, is the draft material of what we're calling the case for action. So I'm going to talk about what that means in a minute, but that will also be up there, and we're really looking for your feedback on that before we take that feedback to our principal committees. This whole activity, as I said earlier, will be part of our next strategic plan, and we really take the strategic plan seriously. You mightn't, but we do, because I'm required to report back to Parliament on how well we've achieved the objectives each time. And if you go onto our website, you'll see our report on the current strategic plan. The Act requires us to identify the major health issues that we plan to work on in the triennium. Now, people have tended to interpret that as research priorities, but given that we have a much broader role than just the funding of research, we believe that these major health areas are the key areas that we want the research translation to faculty to work on. So not just research in these areas, which we already fund, but how we can bridge the gap or move down the end of the arrow, or move back that way in the wedge, as Larry pointed out. So what are those major areas? So these are they in draft form. This has not been signed off yet by our council, but I think you can expect them to be pretty much what will finally work out. So for the first time in the history of the NHMRC, we're going to say we're going to address with purpose what the country calls the National Health Priority Areas. These are, as agreed through health ministers and eventually through the COAG process, so they have quite important official status in the country. If your favourite one's not there, that's not my fault, that's the political system. And as you see, they are disease focused, and I hope that when you see our strategic plan, you'll see that we understand that across these as particular issues, we need to take an approach of prevention as a priority. We need to think of socioeconomic gradients across these and so on. But we're serious about trying to do something in all those health priority areas of the country. The second one, which I'm sure you'd all expect us to pay attention to, is closing the gap between the health of our Aboriginal peoples and the rest of us. The next one is the other end of the scale, I suppose. Probably the most commonly commented comment, that's 3 comments there, over developing a strategic plan is what's the NHMRC going to do about the genomics revolution? Is the health system ready for it? What does it mean for the population? How do we deal with direct-to-consumer testing? All those sorts of issues. So that will be a major priority. Primary health care, evidence-based primary health care. Most Australians, all Australians on average, see their primary physician each year, doctors, but other primary care givers. And how do we help ensure that that's a part of our system that's very evidence-based? Multiple and complex diseases, those things that don't fall easily into one or the other. Many patients will have perhaps cardiovascular disease and diabetes, and maybe also depression as well. And the way we tend to deal with things is in compartments, and that includes the way the NHMRC deals with things through our guidelines work as well. And so on. I won't go through them all, but I put them up now because we're going to start off with trying to identify the key evidence practice gaps in these issues, which will eventually make it into our formal strategic plan. So the invitation to join the faculty will be around just that, identifying the most significant gaps between research evidence and health policy and practice in each of these areas. And then recommending to the NHMRC what to do with it, including possibly a transformational proposal for targeted research. As we get ready to end the year and get our strategic plan to Parliament, we've asked the members of our 2 principal committees, our Healthcare Committee under Claire and the previous chair of Healthcare Committee and the previous Chief Medical Officer of the Commonwealth, John Horvath, is here with us today and is acting as a special helper to the CEO on this and other issues. And the Prevention Committee with David Roeder from South Australia chairing. Each member of those committees will ask to be a minister for these major health issues. So they'll have a sort of a portfolio hat and will be the direct link between the NHMRC principal committees and the research faculty. As well, in each of those areas, we want to set up a small steering group, perhaps 3 or 4 members of the faculty, to work with the broader faculty to bring the ideas to the NHMRC through these 2 principal committees. A key feature of the website will be a module that will allow you to work collaboratively on documents. I'll talk a little bit about what we're expecting to be developed as part of that in a moment. So as I said a moment ago, the key activity we'll be asking you to do is to develop what we're calling a case for action. And we invite a case for action in each of these major health issues to be identified in our plan. We'll establish discussion forums in each of these major areas to allow you to work collaboratively and to contribute to the development of that case for action. The case for action will need to identify the significant gap, a major significant gap between evidence and practice and policy, and put forward a compelling case of actions that the NHMRC could take, working with others, to address that gap. Now, this will be a serious piece of work you'll need to work on. It's not a few ideas thrown on a table. It'll have to be a very strongly evidence-based argument, a deeply academic and scholarly piece of work that will be put to the principal committees in our council, and we will seek reviews of those from the community, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but also from people in the system itself. The hard job, I think, will be to identify a gap in each of these areas, because there are many, many things that need to be done, but so we don't swamp the system or risk getting very diffuse about what we do, we're going to try and hold you as a faculty to the key issues in each area. I suspect that'll lead to a lot of debate, and maybe the whole thing will fall down at this stage, in which case we'll have to think again about it. But it'll be a very important role for the principal committees to just look at the ideas that come up and to feed comment back to make sure that we do bring this to very impactful cases for action. What the case for action needs to address, I'll just run through in a little bit detail. It's both the significance of the gap and why there's a strong need here in Australia to address it. So although we share health issues with other countries with advanced health systems, we want you to concentrate on the Australian context with the peculiarities and strengths and weaknesses of our federated system of healthcare as one of the criteria. You need to address the barriers that are currently preventing the take-up of research into improved policy practice, and we want you to identify the benefits that would result if the gap were closed, and they will include the economic benefits. And so we're very pleased that quite a number of our health services researchers who work in health economics have agreed to be part of the faculty. It then needs to document what the NHMRC should do about it. Now, given you're a bunch of researchers, your first thought will be fund more research, I know, but that will be one of several options, and you'll be put to the test of whether that's the most important action that needs to be taken. So here are some of the others, and we don't want to limit the types of actions or interventions that you might propose to the NHMRC, but we do ask that either positive or negative assessments of the range of interventions that the NHMRC could do be taken into account. So here are some of the things that might be able to be done given our role. We are able, off our own bat, to make direct recommendations to the Minister for Health and Ageing, as we've done on a number of occasions. We can also issue public statements in areas of community concern. A few years ago, we updated our recommendations around fluoridation of water supplies based on an updated literature review, and as a result, a state further north in Australia that wasn't fluoridated felt confident enough to change public policy and fluoridate their water supply. So some of those public statements by the NHMRC can initiate activities elsewhere. I think that's not on that one. The last dot point there in small type, so you don't immediately go there, is further research. So, but if there is a need for funding of specific further research, the faculty will need to make that argument in line with the NHMRC requirements for nominating targeted calls for research. And you'll be able to click through to the criteria for a targeted call for research on the website. These are relatively long-standing criteria that research committee has agreed to. So the case will have to be argued against that. And one of the key criteria there is that this research is needed because of an Australian context, not a more general context. Now, in many of these actions that might need to be taken, sometimes the NHMRC will be able to do these things themselves, such as public statements, but mostly it'll be working to others. It'll be working either to our minister directly, working with the Department of Health and Ageing, our big sister, working with other agencies in the healthcare system, such as the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare, the National Lead Clinicians Group, and I think especially under the changes in health reform, working directly with the National Health Performance Agency, which will be responsible for reporting back to the Commonwealth, states and territory governments now on the performance of the health system, which I suspect will be a very important partner in this activity. And we've already had some early discussions with the new National Health Performance Agency around this activity. The other body I should mention is the new Independent Health Pricing Agency, which is going to set a price on things, and I'm sure they'll have an interest in this activity as well. One of the questions I'm asked is why limit membership to the NHMRC funded researchers? It's absolutely pragmatics. When we first raised this idea, many groups in our society said, gee, that's interesting, we'd like to be involved. And I just really honestly don't have the resources to do anything that wide. And so we've got other ways of incorporating outside input into this. But the original selection criteria, as I said earlier, you've survived through NHMRC's peer review processes, so we're completely confident that we have high quality members of the faculty. But there will be others. There'll be clinicians, there'll be public health experts, there'll be people in the community, in NGOs and so on, who are interested in being involved, and we certainly intend to do that. I'd encourage you all, as you do the work here, to use your own networks to consult, to bring people into the conversation. But we will also, we are in the process of establishing, through Samantha Robinson in the second row here too, a new community-based input into the NHMRC called the Community and Consumer Committee, and we will be asking the members of that committee to comment on the proposals that you'll be developing as they come forward. All right, so you've had great thoughts and you've had a terrific idea of how to improve, I don't know, Jock, effective community-based hypertension control, or whatever it is. That's not a hint. You've worked to the steering group and you've brought an idea to fruition. What happens next? Well, it will go to one of our principal committees, and I guess always the Community Health and Prevention Committee and the Health Care Committee, and they will be asked to prioritise NHMRC's action on the basis of some very specific criteria. They will be, in brief, how well does it align with what NHMRC wants to do, the significance of the proposal and the likelihood for it to benefit patients if the aims are met, and I guess the general approach, what you're proposing should be done. Is it sensible? Is it well argued? Is it appropriate to Australia? Is it likely to make a difference? The principal committees will then make a recommendation to Council, but as this emerges, we'll be working with the Department, the Minister, the States and Territories, these other organisations where they are required. We want to do this as publicly as we can, so we're hoping to make the developing cases for action available publicly so that there can be broader consultation about them as well. We want to make sure that we acknowledge appropriately your intellectual work on this, and so attribution of ideas will be an important part of what we do. So now it's really over to you. I should say that, as I said earlier, this identifying the biggest thing that should be done in these major health issues and then what should be done about it is really the first step on the research translation faculty. Hopefully, as we develop and perhaps as the government considers the recommendations of the future role of the NHMRC in response to the McKeon review, there'll be other activities that we're able to support more earlier than we currently expect, but we will be just generally reaching into the faculty for advice on all the matters that the NHMRC Council needs to support. Some of you who are sad enough to watch or read Senate estimates will know that the hottest item that the NHMRC is currently dealing with, in fact, are there adverse effects of wind turbines, but don't go there. But we do hope we can reach into the faculty frequently to get help with some of these things that outside the research side of the NHMRC we deal with on a day-to-day basis. I think, Claire, it's now over to questions and answer time, which you might facilitate for me. I know that I've only given you the barest outline about what this is about, but we are hoping that when we give you the case for fund documentation, which is only a few pages, that you can think about it very carefully and you can give us feedback on what needs to be tweaked or changed to make sure that we're able to help you help us with this task. So thanks again.